4,000 children vanished from the regime's tracking system. They weren't processed at the camps. They weren't found in the mass deportations. They simply disappeared. And the most unexpected place in the Pacific Northwest became their refuge, a remote mountain village where farmers and teachers turned their homes, schools, and barns into a living sanctuary. But here's the detail that will challenge everything you thought you knew about resistance. These children weren't locked away in hidden cellars or mountain caves. They walked the village streets. They sat in classrooms. They sang in the town square. And the Iron Guard, with all their surveillance apparatus and reign of terror, never found them. How do you hide 4,000 lives in broad daylight? The answer lies in Oakhaven. And the story you're about to discover was nearly erased from the historical record for decades. It was 1942. The shadow of the new order had fallen across the continent. The regime had begun its systematic hunt for the unlabeled, marking them, tearing them from their homes, and shipping them toward an uncertain fate in work camps and detention facilities. Children were separated from their parents at processing centers, where entire families waited under armed guard. The terror was methodical. The machine was efficient. And in the middle of this nightmare, there was Oakhaven, an isolated village of 5,000 inhabitants perched on a plateau in the rugged mountains of the Pacific Northwest at 4,200 feet above sea level. It was cold, it was poor, and it was founded by outcasts. That last detail matters more than you think. Oakhaven was built by the descendants of religious refugees who had fled persecution generations earlier. They knew what it meant to be hunted. Their own family histories were marked by midnight escapes, survival in the wilderness, and the memory of ancestors imprisoned for their beliefs. When the regime rose to power and began hunting the displaced, the people of Oakhaven didn't see strangers. They saw themselves a century ago. And they made a decision. They wouldn't stand by and watch, not this time. It all started with one man, Elder Benjamin Allen, the moral leader of the community. A weathered man with steady eyes and a voice that commanded respect. Benjamin wasn't a conventional hero. He was a farmer, a father, and a man haunted by a past moment of cowardice he could never undo. But when the regime issued orders requiring all communities to report unlabeled travelers, Benjamin did something extraordinary. He refused. And from the steps of the village meeting house, he declared that his people had a sacred duty to hide, protect, and save anyone fleeing persecution. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a moral imperative. And his village remarkably obeyed. But here's what makes this story different from any other resistance story you've ever heard. It wasn't a covert operation led by an elite few. It was a mass conspiracy. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, children, everyone knew, everyone participated, and everyone kept the secret. To understand why an entire village would risk everything for strangers, you need to go back 120 years to a winter that nearly destroyed them all. In 1822, a group of religious dissidents fled persecution in the Eastern Territories. They refused to swear loyalty oaths to the state church, refused to register their children in government records, and refused to accept that any earthly authority could stand between their conscience and their God. For this defiance, their homes were burned, their leaders imprisoned, and their families scattered like leaves in a storm. 73 men, women, and children made the brutal journey west through mountain passes that had already claimed dozens of lives that season. They carried nothing but their faith, their trauma, and a single vow carved into a wooden beam from their burned meeting house. We were strangers, and you took us in. When they finally reached the isolated plateau that would become Oakhaven, they weren't welcomed. The few trappers and traders in the region saw them as fanatics, troublemakers who brought government attention to a place that thrived on being forgotten. But the exiles survived. They cleared the rocky soil with their bare hands, built their homes from mountain stone, and established a community based on a single, unshakable principle, that every person fleeing persecution had an absolute right to sanctuary, no questions asked. For generations, this wasn't just philosophy, it was practice. Oak Haven became known as a place where people running from violent spouses, corrupt sheriffs, or vengeful creditors could disappear and start over. The villagers didn't ask for your story. They asked what name you wanted to use and whether you could work. By the time Benjamin Allen was born in 1992, the Oak Haven Creed had been recited at every town meeting for a century. We remember the road that brought us here. We remember the doors that were closed. We remember the few who opened theirs, and we will be those few. When the regime began hunting the displaced in 1941, the people of Oak Haven didn't debate. They didn't form committees or take votes. They simply looked at those terrified children arriving in the dead of night and saw their own ancestors, cold, desperate, and praying that someone, somewhere, would choose mercy over fear. The creed wasn't just words anymore. It was about to become the most dangerous promise they'd ever kept. The loyalty oath arrived on a Tuesday morning in November 1941, delivered by a regional administrator in a pressed uniform and polished boots. Every community leader in the territory was required to sign it within 72 hours. The document was simple, just 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that could be summarized in one sentence. You will report anyone the regime designates as unlabeled, or you will be considered an enemy of the state. Benjamin Allen read it twice in the silence of his study, the morning light cutting through the window and illuminating the dust motes that hung in the air like tiny witnesses. He was 63 years old, his hands scarred from decades of farm work, his face weathered by mountain winters. He had never been a revolutionary. He had never even raised his voice in anger at a town meeting. But as he stared at that document, he felt something ancient and immovable rise up in his chest. He thought about his grandfather, who had carried that burned wooden beam across 1,000 miles of wilderness. He thought about the children he'd seen in the village square just that morning, laughing and chasing each other in the cold autumn air. And he thought about the moment 30 years ago when he had stayed silent as a drifter was dragged from the general store by marshals, a moment that still woke him in the night with shame burning in his throat. Benjamin Allen picked up his pen, and instead of signing the oath, he wrote across it in firm, deliberate strokes, "No man's law can command me to betray the innocent." That Sunday he stood before the entire village in the meeting house, the unsigned oath in his hand. His voice was steady, but everyone who knew him could hear the tremor of fear beneath it. He told them what was coming. He told them that hiding the displaced would mean forged documents, constant vigilance, and the very real possibility of arrest or worse. He told them that anyone who wanted to leave Oak Haven, to distance themselves from what he was about to do, should go now with his blessing and no judgment. No one moved. Not a single person stood to leave. And then Benjamin spoke the words that would transform his village into a conspiracy. "Our doors are open. From this day forward, any child fleeing the regime's persecution will find sanctuary here. We will give them new names, new papers, and new lives, and we will do this until the last of us is dragged from our homes or until this evil is defeated. The choice before us is not safety or danger. It is whether we will be able to look at ourselves in the mirror when this is over." The silence that followed wasn't uncertainty. It was resolve hardening into steel. Oak Haven had just declared war on the most powerful regime in the world, and they had done it without firing a single shot. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters and those who side with the Iron Guard would scroll past this. They arrived on a February night in 1942. 53 children packed into the back of 2 unmarked trucks that had navigated mountain roads in complete darkness. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 15. They were exhausted, terrified, and they had no idea where they were. There was no grand coordination, no emergency meeting, no committee assigned to manage the logistics of hiding 53 human beings in a village that was already struggling to feed itself through a brutal winter. What happened next was something far more remarkable than a plan. It was collective instinct. Martha Green, who ran the general store, saw the trucks from her upstairs window. She didn't call the constable. She didn't wake the town council. She simply walked downstairs, lit every lamp in her shop, and propped open the door. Within 20 minutes, 7 other families had done the same. Light spilled from windows across the village, like a silent signal that needed no explanation. We're ready. By the time Benjamin Allen arrived at the village square, half the children had already disappeared into homes. The Harris family took in 3 siblings who couldn't be separated. Old Thomas Brennan, a widower who hadn't spoken more than 10 words a week to anyone in years, walked up to a trembling boy of 7 and said simply, "You'll stay with me." The schoolteacher, Margaret Chen, counted heads and announced she could fit 6 in her cottage if people could spare blankets. They could. They did. There were no contracts signed, no formal agreements, no bureaucratic process. The villagers operated on something deeper than paperwork, a mutual trust so profound that it didn't need to be spoken. They understood that the moment you wrote something down, you created evidence. The moment you created a central list of who was hiding whom, you created a target. So they didn't. Each family made their own choice, took in who they could, and the only record was the one kept in 5,000 memories that would never break. By dawn, all 53 children had vanished into the fabric of Oak Haven. They had new names picked from old family Bibles, new stories rehearsed over breakfast, and new identities that would be defended by an entire village of people who had never needed to be told what to do. The gates hadn't just opened, they had dissolved. There was no longer any line between them and us. There were only children who needed protecting and adults who refused to fail them. And this was just the beginning. Over the next 4 years, that number would grow to 4,000. Sarah Allen worked in the basement of the old library behind a false wall that had once been used to store banned religious texts during her great-grandfather's time. The room was barely 8 feet square, lit by a single oil lamp that she kept dimmed to avoid drawing attention. On the wooden table in front of her sat the tools of her dangerous trade: stolen government stamps, bottles of ink mixed to match official documents, blank identity cards procured through a network she would never name, and a collection of signatures she had practiced 10,000 times until her hand could forge them in her sleep. She was 28 years old, a schoolteacher by day and a criminal by night, and she was extraordinarily good at her job. Every child who arrived in Oak Haven needed papers. Not crude forgeries that would fall apart under scrutiny, but perfect documents that could pass inspection by Iron Guard officers trained to spot inconsistencies. Birth certificates with dates that matched real registry entries, school enrollment forms with signatures from officials who actually existed, ration cards with serial numbers that corresponded to authentic batches. Sarah didn't just create fake identities, she created ghosts that could walk through checkpoints and blend seamlessly into the regime's own records. The process was meticulous and exhausting. She would start with a real child from Oak Haven's past, someone who had died young, whose death had been recorded in church records but never properly filed with the regional authorities. She would resurrect them on paper, aging them up, changing minor details, and weaving them back into existence. Then she would backdate documents, creating a paper trail that stretched back years. School attendance records, medical visits, a library card from 3 towns over. She built entire lives out of ink and lies. Her father had begged her to stop. The penalty for forging government documents wasn't imprisonment, it was execution, carried out publicly as a warning to others. But Sarah had her own ghosts to answer to. She had been teaching at the regional school in the valley when the first deportations began. She had watched from her classroom window as children were loaded onto trucks, and she had done nothing. She had kept her head down, finished her lesson plan, and gone home to the safety of Oakhaven. That silence had carved out something hollow inside her that only this work could fill. By 1944, Sarah Allen had created over 2,000 false identities. The regime would later estimate that she had caused more damage to their tracking system than any single act of sabotage during the entire war. They would hunt for the paper ghost for years, never knowing she had been a schoolteacher who worked by lamplight in a room that didn't officially exist. If you can't stand manipulators like Commander Vane, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. The warning system was born from necessity on a March afternoon in 1943, when an Iron Guard patrol appeared on the mountain road with no advance notice. They had 20 minutes before the trucks reached the village square. 20 minutes to hide proof of 800 children who weren't supposed to exist. The church bells couldn't be used. That would be too obvious, too traceable. Shouting would create panic and questions. Running door to door would waste precious seconds and leave witnesses to interrogate. So they improvised with what they had: lanterns, windows, and a code so simple that even the youngest children could understand it. One lantern in a window meant routine patrol. Stay calm, act natural. 2 lanterns meant inspection coming. Hide the extra rations, remove the additional bedding, make sure every child knew their false name and backstory. 3 lanterns meant raid imminent, evacuate to the caves immediately, take only what you can carry, and go silent until the all clear. The system spread through the village in minutes, passed from window to window like a chain of tiny fires. Rebecca Foster lit 2 lanterns in her kitchen and watched as the Johnsons across the street did the same. The blacksmith saw it and lit his forge window. The baker saw the forge and lit her storefront. Within 8 minutes, every household in Oakhaven knew that Iron Guard inspectors were 3 miles out and closing fast. What happened next was choreographed chaos. Children who had been playing in the square vanished as if they'd never existed. Extra chairs disappeared from dining rooms. Beds were stripped and remade to look like they'd only held one person. Forged documents were pulled from hiding spots and laid out on kitchen tables where inspectors would find them naturally. The village transformed itself from a sanctuary housing hundreds of fugitives into a quiet mountain town with nothing to hide. By the time the Iron Guard trucks rolled into the square, Oakhaven looked exactly like what it claimed to be: a poor, isolated community of farmers barely scraping by. The children were in the mountain caves 2 miles north, tucked into spaces that had hidden their ancestors a century before, and not a single villager had spoken a word out loud. The beauty of the system was its silence. No orders barked, no instructions shouted, no evidence left behind, just light in windows and a community that moved like a single organism protecting its heart. The Iron Guard would conduct 17 raids over the next 2 years. They would never find a single child, and they would never understand that they were being warned the moment their trucks left the garrison.
Commander Victor Vane arrived in Oakhaven on a gray October morning in 1943, and everyone who saw him understood immediately that this was different. The previous inspectors had been bureaucrats following checklists. Vane was a hunter who had built his reputation on breaking resistance networks across 3 territories. He stood at the stone bridge that marked the entrance to the village, his black uniform crisp despite the mountain cold, his eyes scanning the buildings with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Behind him, 2 trucks of Iron Guard soldiers waited for orders. Benjamin Allen walked out to meet him alone. The conversation that followed would be retold in Oakhaven for generations, every word memorized like scripture. Vane spoke first, his voice carrying the casual menace of someone who held all the power. "Elder Allen, I've reviewed the reports from this village. Your population numbers don't match your ration requests. Your school enrollment has increased by 40% in 2 years, and yet you claim no new families have moved here? Would you care to explain this statistical anomaly?" Benjamin didn't flinch. He met Vane's gaze with the same steady calm he'd shown from the pulpit for 30 years. "Commander, we are a religious community. We believe that children are a blessing from God, regardless of their origin. Some of these children were born to unwed mothers who sought refuge here.
Some were orphaned by the war and brought to us by relatives. We don't ask questions that aren't our business. We simply care for the souls entrusted to us." "How convenient," Vane said, his smile razor-thin, "that your piety aligns so perfectly with harboring enemies of the state." "Our piety," Benjamin replied, "aligns with the commandment to care for the fatherless. If the state considers that treasonous, then I suppose we've been traitors since this village was founded." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Vane could order a full inspection. He could tear apart every home, interrogate every child, and arrest anyone who couldn't prove their identity to his satisfaction. But Benjamin had gambled on something crucial. The regime wanted to appear civilized. They needed villages like Oakhaven to maintain the fiction that the new order was about law and prosperity, not terror. Raiding a holy community without absolute proof would create martyrs and bad press. Vane stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Benjamin could hear. "I know what you're doing here, old man, and when I prove it, I will personally escort you to the gallows." Benjamin didn't step back. "Then I suppose we both have work to do, Commander." Vane returned to his truck. The convoy rolled back down the mountain, and Oakhaven had just bought itself 6 more months. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully. Let's see who has the heart to speak up.
They came at dawn on April 12, 1944. 6 trucks, 40 soldiers, and Commander Vane leading them with the cold efficiency of a man who had finally gathered enough evidence to destroy everything Benjamin Allen had built. But Oakhaven had eyes on every road. A farmhand named Jacob Pierce had been repairing a fence 3 miles down the mountain when he saw the convoy. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply walked to the nearest house and lit 3 lanterns in the window. Then he continued repairing his fence as if nothing had happened. The signal rippled through the village in 7 minutes. By the time the Iron Guard trucks rolled past the stone bridge, 800 children had already vanished. The schoolhouse was Vane's first target. He kicked open the door, expecting to find the evidence he needed. Overcrowded classrooms, mismatched ages, children who couldn't answer basic questions about their supposed families. Instead, he found 23 students sitting quietly at their desks, their teacher, Margaret Chen, calmly writing arithmetic problems on the chalkboard. "Line up for inspection," Vane commanded. The children obeyed without hesitation, each one producing papers that Sarah Allen had spent months perfecting. Birth certificates with dates that matched, school records that traced back years. When Vane demanded they recite their family histories, they did so without a single hesitation or contradiction. These weren't frightened fugitives stumbling through lies. They were ghosts who had been practicing their resurrection stories every single day. Vane moved through the village like a man tearing apart a house searching for termites. He inspected homes, counted beds, interrogated shopkeepers about ration distributions. But everywhere he looked, the numbers aligned, the stories matched, the papers were perfect. It was as if the 800 children he knew were hiding here had simply evaporated into mountain air. What Vane didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that those children were less than 2 miles away, huddled in the cave system that had sheltered religious dissidents for over a century. They sat in darkness, wrapped in blankets, eating cold rations, and staying absolutely silent. The oldest ones kept the youngest calm with whispered stories. No one cried, no one panicked. They had drilled this evacuation 17 times before. Above them, in the village, their protectors played their roles with the calm of people who had already decided that some things were worth dying for. The raid lasted 11 hours. Vane left empty-handed, his fury so palpable that his own soldiers kept their distance during the drive back to the garrison. He had been certain this time, absolutely certain, and Oakhaven had made him look like a fool. But the village knew something Vane didn't. A cornered hunter becomes more dangerous, not less, and their luck was about to run out.
Emma Reeves was 24 years old when they came for her. She taught the youngest children at the village school, the ones who still needed help tying their shoes and remembering which hand was left and which was right. She had soft brown eyes, a patient voice, and a secret that Commander Vane had spent 18 months trying to uncover. She knew where the caves were. Every entrance, every passage, every hiding spot that could shelter a child. Vane's intelligence network had finally identified her as the weak link, not because she was careless, but because she was kind. She had been seen comforting a crying child who had slipped and called her by the wrong name. She had been observed carrying extra blankets toward the northern ridge on a day when no official school activity was scheduled. Small details, but enough. On a cold morning in November 1944, the Iron Guard arrested her in front of her classroom and dragged her to the garrison for interrogation. They gave her every opportunity to cooperate. They explained that she could walk free, return to her students, and live a normal life if she simply drew a map. They promised her that the children wouldn't be harmed, only relocated to proper facilities where they could be educated correctly. They told her she was being foolish, throwing her life away for people who weren't even her own. Emma Reeves said nothing. When promises failed, they tried pain. For 3 days she endured interrogation sessions that left even hardened soldiers uncomfortable. And for 3 days she gave them absolutely nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, not even a glance in the direction of the mountains that might betray what she was protecting. What Emma understood, what Vane never could, was that those 3 days weren't about her survival. They were about buying time. Every hour she stayed silent was another hour for the village to move the children deeper into the mountain system, to cover their tracks, to relocate supplies, and to prepare new routes. Her silence was a weapon, and she wielded it with more courage than any soldier on that base. On the 4th day, they executed her in the garrison courtyard. The official record stated she had been convicted of treason and conspiracy against the state. What the record didn't say was that she had died without speaking a single word that could harm a child. She was 24 years old, and she had just saved 800 lives. When news reached Oakhaven, Benjamin Allen stood before the village and spoke 6 words that would be carved into her memorial stone. She kept the faith until death. The children stayed hidden for 2 more weeks. Not one was found. Emma Reeves had bought them the time they needed, paying a price that no one should ever have to pay. If you can't stand people who gatekeep the truth and prey on the weak, comment, "Everyone deserves respect." The regime fell in the spring of 1945, collapsing under the weight of its own brutality and the resistance it had created. When the news reached Oakhaven, there was no celebration, no cheering in the streets, just a profound, exhausted silence as people who had lived in fear for 4 years finally allowed themselves to breathe. Benjamin Allen stood in the village square on a May morning and spoke to the children who have hidden for so long. "You are free now," he said, his voice breaking on the word. "Free to use your real names, free to find your families, free to stop pretending to be someone else." And then he did something he had never done in public before. He wept. Over the following weeks, the children of Oakhaven began to reclaim their identities. David became Daniel again. Anna remembered she was actually Miriam. A boy who had spent 3 years answering to Thomas finally got to hear someone call him by the name his mother had given him. Some children were reunited with parents who had survived. Others learned they were orphans now, and the families who had hidden them chose to keep them forever. Of the 4,000 children who had passed through Oakhaven during those 4 years, 3,847 survived. It was the highest survival rate of any sanctuary network documented during the war. And it had been accomplished not by trained soldiers or intelligence operatives, but by farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers who simply refused to look away when evil asked them to. The world eventually learned Oakhaven's story, though the village tried to keep it quiet. They didn't consider themselves heroes. They considered themselves people who had done the minimum required of any decent human being. Benjamin Allen, when interviewed years later, would say only this: "We didn't save those children. They saved us. They reminded us who we were supposed to be." Commander Victor Vane was tried for war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. He never understood how Oakhaven had beaten him. Even at his trial, when presented with testimony from dozens of survivors, he insisted there must have been outside help, some sophisticated resistance network, some elaborate scheme. He could not accept that he had been defeated by ordinary people armed with nothing but conviction and 3 lanterns in a window.
Sarah Allen lived to be 91. She never spoke publicly about the paper ghost, but her basement workspace was preserved as a memorial after her death. Emma Reeves was posthumously honored with medals from 3 nations, though Benjamin insisted the only recognition she would have wanted was to see the children she died protecting grow old and free. Oakhaven still stands today, population now barely 2,000. But on a stone memorial in the village square, 4,000 names are carved, not of the villagers who protected them, but of the children who were worth protecting. And at the top, a simple inscription: "Some lines are sacred." If you believe ordinary people can change the world, hit subscribe and drop a comment on what you think about Benjamin Allen's choice. Like and share this video to make sure the Iron Guards of the world never win.